Welcome to the 12th episode of Peter York's Culture Wars House Party. I'm Peter York, and my podcast is about culture wars, the way modern politics is so often played out with symbols and scapegoats, with lying and astroturf organisations instead of the real things and the big debates. I'll be talking to the players and commentators in these culture wars and getting them to explain what they think is really happening. We'll have some fun and some gossip, and we'll ask some vital questions, like who makes the best suede loafers in Jermyn Street, that sort of thing. Now, Guyanese-born Gina Miller is a financial business owner who heads a financial advisor business for women clients. But she's become famous as a particular kind of activist, following the Brexit referendum in 2016, when she challenged the May government over its right to implement Brexit without taking it to Parliament. And then, in 2019, she successfully challenged the Johnson government over its prorogation of Parliament, a process which ended with the Supreme Court judge, Lady Hale, declaring it unlawful. She's found in a number of campaigns, not a very typical city financial business sort of thing, including one against investments and pension funds, sort of overcharging their clients. She's been a bit less visible recently. She's had cancer with surgery and radiotherapy, but she's re-emerged as a candidate in the 2025 competition to become the Chancellor of Cambridge. Now, Gina came to this country from multicultural Guyana to a girls' boarding school, Moira House on the Sussex coast, which interestingly merged with Rodine but closed for good 2 years later. It's a very interesting place, Guyana. More of that later. Good afternoon, Gina Miller. You've been a very active activist, and some people have been very angry about all that, even trying to employ hitmen to kill you. Why do you think they were quite so angry with you?
It's an absolute pleasure to join you, Peter. Yes, I've been puzzling that. Why is it that I seem to rile some people to the extremes of not the usual levels of hate, but actually, what violence against me and as you said, hiring hitmen and even a Viscount going to prison, which is one of the things that a precedent I set, a new precedent in court. There are a number of reasons, I think. One is I don't shy away from those issues that people take as too difficult. They, be it, as you've mentioned in your introduction, what's been going on in the city, a lot of the rip-offs and dubious behaviours that led to the financial crisis, the opacity of fees, and what's been going on in Parliament, modern-day slavery, and then, yes, Brexit. I don't shy away. I'm not frightened by the status quo or institutions or, big brands and big individuals. One of the things that I've always disliked is intellectual dishonesty. And I think people in positions of power and influence have a duty to behave in an even more responsible way than an ordinary citizen. And I find it galling when they abuse those positions or are silent. And so taking on issues that people say are too difficult or there are myths around or taboos, it doesn't register with me. If I come across something, and I haven't, Peter, gone out and sought specifically for battles, when I come across something in my campaigning life or my professional life or my personal life that are just wrong, then I will speak up about them.
Do you think you being brown and a woman made for opponents extra keen to have you killed, or how did it work?
Without a doubt. I was actually told by an editor of one of the mainstream newspapers that I was the perfect avatar of hate. He couldn't have designed a better one. All the tropes of speaking too well, having gone to a boarding school, even though it was quite a dysfunctional boarding school. We were from misfits, I think, which was wonderful in its own way. Calling out dishonesty, standing up against institutions, but being a woman of colour has definitely took it to a different level. And I find it extraordinarily disappointing that in the advancements we've made, a lot of the things I'm called and the hate I get takes me back to the 1970s and the things that were being said then. You know, I'm still called a monkey. My children, for being mixed race, are called mongrels that should be put down at birth. Go back home. You know, as a woman of colour, I'm only good for one thing. All of these things. And the other one, which I find very interesting, Peter, is the idea that I can't be bright enough, or it can't be my money that I'm fighting with, that there must be some powerful men behind me using me. And that is just so extraordinarily, if you like, angering to think that that is a perception that some people have.
All this, as you say, is the language of the 70s and even before that. But people presumably feel safe to say these kinds of things online and anonymously or pseudonymously.
No, this is what has changed since, I think, specifically 2016 across the pond in the US and in the UK, is that things that were said on the fringes of our society are now been given permission to be much more mainstream. And that's offline as well as online. People would actually come up and tell me to my face walking down the street. When I was going through my chemo treatment, this gentleman who was also going through treatment came up to me on the ward to my face and said, "You're that woman, you're Gina Miller, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I hope you die." I mean, it's extraordinary that someone would say that to me on the ward.
Wow. You say that there's been a change of mood, that what was formerly at the margins, formerly historic, etc., has come into the centre. Why should that be in the 2020s?
The tale, I think, has gone all the way back, and you can trace back to the global financial crisis, in my view, is that politicians post the financial crisis, who, as Osborne said, should be fixing roofs, actually were weak politicians, and they were showmen. You know, Cameron and Osborne, in my view, were not the right couple to be leading our country at that time. They didn't look at what was going on, the systemic failures in our institutions, in our systems, in our society. And, you know, when practical things like borrowing rates were so low, we should have, instead of austerity, we should have invested in our country. We should have sought to put things right. And because of that neglect, I think the distrust of institutions, you know, they're all the same attitude towards politicians, the allowing of snake oil salesmen to sow, you know, the seeds of hate and disruption and to sell their snake oil has become much more palatable to people than it was before then. So our society is broken. And because of the lack of honest debate about that and the courage to seek to put it right, I think that distrust of not just society and institutions, but actually of each other, we look at each other with suspicion rather than compassion now. And I think all of that has led to this rising to the surface of an anger and a willingness to destroy rather than to debate is what's led us to where we are.
So, in other words, when you talk about snake oil salesmen, I imagine that you're talking about leading populist politicians who seem to have rather snaky formats.
But also the individuals who sold Brexit when they had no idea what was going to happen, or actually never, from the conversations I had with quite a few of them, never believed they'd actually win. They thought, and therefore had no plan for when they won. So it's a populist movement. And we've seen it throughout history. We've seen it before. This is not a new playbook. It is literally a playbook where you attack the media, you attack freedom of speech, you attack the law and the judges, you attack individuals who are standing up and speaking out, and you demonize certain sections of society. It's an old playbook that has been used time and time again throughout history, and here we are again.
Now, the Brexit campaign always struck me as the definitive UK culture wars, because the Leave case was made quite brilliantly and worked on grievances that were really deeply felt, but not really about our EU membership. And you could see that for years and years and years, because when challenged Brexit callers, and there were lots of them, to James O'Brien on LBC, the Brexit supporting callers could never name anything about the EU that had affected them personally, because you'd have thought they'd know that question was coming, because James O'Brien always asked it and said, what about Brexit affected you personally? And they couldn't name anything. And they could mumble this long, grand word, sovereignty, but they could never explain exactly what it was. So if the Leavers didn't know what they were voting for exactly, or could say what they were voting for, but it was a feeling, as you say, how about the Leave bosses and the strategists? What were their motives, do you think? I'm thinking of Farage, Aaron Banks, Dominic Cummings, Matthew Elliott, and their various American helpers, of whom there were a fair few, of course. What was in it for them? Why were they doing it?
Very simply, power and money. Because
power and money.
Because these are individuals who believe in low regulation. They didn't want us to be part of the EU. Even James Dyson, one of the reasons he was very upset, because certain EU directives meant that he couldn't sell his products in Europe because they were seen as using too much power and not being environmentally friendly. So he had a personal reason for not wanting to be in the EU. And the same goes for Lord Bamford. Bamford had taken lost several court cases in Europe, again, for selling his machinery because they didn't meet EU rules. So these are individuals whose ability to make money was being stifled by EU regulations. And those people I know in the city and knew very well, who were Brexiteers all the way back from the sort of 80s, were the ones who were saying too much regulation. These were free marketeers who believed that EU membership, the ones I knew, these are people in power. And they had different reasons, but it was about money in their businesses and the ability for them to supposedly run the country the way they saw fit, or they felt they needed to run the country. But for the ordinary person in the street, going up to, say, North Wales, when I went up to visit there during the campaign, it was much more, we want our country back. Those were the words that were being repeated. And this is where I agree with you, and I'm not very popular for saying it. The Leave campaign, and now those proponents in reform, etc., are brilliant campaigners. They're brilliant communicators. They understand how to really get under the skin of people's feelings. It's not about facts, and it's not about the data, and it's not about the benefits. The number of people who said to me after, who regretted voting for Brexit, who said to me afterwards, we never noticed the EU flag on our library, on our swimming pool, in our local area. We didn't realise what being members of the EU meant. We didn't realise that we couldn't be in the Dublin Agreement, so we couldn't send back people who came across illegally. And part of that, I have to say, lay at the feet of our government and actually the EU, because we didn't really educate or talk to people about the EU, what it was, what it did. And Churchill's reason for saying, never again. The foundations of the EU was to ensure that collectively we prospered, but also, very importantly, we lived in peace. And so, we haven't really taught, and I've had this conversation around Europe with other countries who have seen the rise of the right as well, is that we haven't really educated, they haven't educated, the EU hasn't really gone out of its way to explain itself to be much more accountable and much more transparent. And I was an advocate for remaining, but very much reforming the EU to become much more accountable and transparent. And unfortunately, we fell, and which we still do today, we fall into a world where there is no nuance, there's just black and white. And that suits the populists very well, because they can make very emotive claims without any substance or any need to back it up.
And it is extraordinary how effective the populist playbook and the mantras in there have been across the world. George Monbiot was remarking that there seems to be, a secret sauce that works, and that centrists, social democrats, quotes, well, not the party, but the position, cannot understand and cannot oppose effectively. Why are they so ineffective at dealing with populists?
I've been wondering and toying and trying to intellectualize and simulate this and think about it from an empathetic point of view. And I think there's so much here, but I would point out the fact that the egos get in the way. The idea that you're right and you therefore don't listen to the other side, I think is an error, a great error of judgment. The other one I'd say is to think that the populists are stupid. They're not stupid. To dismiss and devalue their position, it's there for a reason, and we have to listen and we have to understand, and you bring people with you. And I think there's that arrogance and that gets in the way of doing that. So that's one thing I'd say. The other thing I'd say is that it's very intricate and very strategic, and the people behind it are so. If you look pre or around 2016, what was being funded around the world from American institutions such as the Heritage Foundation, the Christian Fundamentalist Movement, the Bannons of the world, Legatum Institutes, all these institutes who were funding chaos, not necessarily taking one side or the other, but look at what happened in Spain with Catalonia, Northern Ireland with the Brexit debate, and so many others, and in Africa as well, because we forget a lot of what's going on in Africa. It's about chaos, because out of chaos comes opportunity. And that is very much a strategy of theirs. It's not always about wanting to win or take one side or the other. And then the third thing I'd say is the invention of the internet. You could not get a better tool for the populist movement than algorithms that only feed you one side of an argument and actually make you think that everybody else agrees with you. So when I go back to that point that those people who were on the fringes of society and possibly sat at the end of a bar or a pub or whatever, or a bench and howled, and shouted on their own, or in a street corner in Trafalgar Square or Hyde Park, now suddenly online, they're liked and they're fed and they're suddenly made to feel that their point of view is not just valid, but is mainstream and is the majority. And that's what algorithms are doing. So you have basically, the social media platforms have become the perfect tool for poisoning society with populism.
Yep. And it's interesting that you start, in the British case, with two tremendously rich men, Dyson and Bamford, and their personal ambitions, as opposed to any that you could describe as conventionally political or conventionally improving for the population as a whole. And that's why, in a number of cases, those sorts of people have kept deliberately in the background and hired very clever mercenaries to make their cases, as it seems. Now, in this great push and pull of rival political claims, Steve Bannon, as he used to say, filling the zone with shit, all that stuff, you came as a new sort of contender, as a new sort of voice. And I suspect people weren't able to make up their minds as to where you were coming from, because you didn't come with a party label, but you did come with a business and city one.
You're absolutely right. People found it very difficult to understand why I was doing this and who, and, there was always questions, who's behind me, and what is it all about? You must be a Remainer. Actually, as I said, I wanted to put for Remain and Reform, and it wasn't about Brexit. I tried very hard, and obviously the media didn't help. They're incredibly powerful, and the media owners had their own side that they had chosen, particular ones. But, the idea that I was defending parliamentary sovereignty is quite ironic. That was the thing that everyone was banging on the table as the main reason, not understanding necessarily what it meant, but that was the reason we had to take back control. And yet we had two prime ministers trying to take away all the ordinary person's control by bypassing Parliament. So the idea that I was fighting a constitutional case that was about Parliament just was lost in, or reduced in a way, to it's about stopping Brexit. And neither one of the cases could stop Brexit. Because the nuance that was missed by both is that, in both cases, is that we don't have a written constitution. So precedent makes up a large part of our constitution. We do have a constitution, it's just not written in one place. And Mrs. May, for example, triggering Article 50 and taking away our rights, was using what's called the royal prerogative on the domestic plane. So putting that in plain terms, the precedent would have been set if she had been allowed to do so, to trigger Article 50 using the royal prerogative, that, you know, a prime minister could just announce that all 16-year-olds have got to join the army and do service, or that they were going to change all the abortion rights in the country. So they could change our lives without consulting Parliament, and that is the precedent that would have been set. And to my mind, we would have become an autocratic government then, or an autocratic state. So that's why, for me, the Article 50 case was the biggest constitutional case for 200 years for a reason. It was going to change the powers that sat at the feet of a prime minister. And when it came to Boris Johnson using the prorogation of Parliament to make sure that we left without a deal, because that's what would have happened, because at the time there was this act called the Benn Act that had gone through Parliament, and it had a date of the 31st of October, at which time Boris Johnson had to come back to Parliament and explain the deal that we were leaving under. And they were not at all worried. I heard through several sources that they were not at all worried about that, because he was going to prorogue Parliament, close it down, which is legal, but for the purpose of going past that date of the 31st of October. So it was going to be for 5 weeks. And what that would have meant is that we would have crashed out, missed all the deadlines for you, with no deal. And that's what Cummings wanted. That's what the people behind Boris wanted. I'm not convinced Boris himself actually thought much about this. He was not one for details and thinking ahead. You know, he's an opportunist, and you know, power was everything to him. But the people behind him most definitely wanted us to leave with no deal. And that would have been, to my mind, it's not just the fact that they were using the prorogation powers illegally, but they would have made the UK a pariah state. And I had spoken to lawyers at the WHO, I'd spoken to lawyers at the European Court of Justice, I'd spoken to international lawyers around the globe, and they were all agog as to why the UK would ever want to put itself in that position, because there was no legal standing. Everyone would view us as a pariah state, and we wouldn't belong to we would breach every single international treaty, and we wouldn't be able to operate. It was baffling to me why we would ever, but I didn't go into that detail. I just thought we need to stop this.
Well, there you were, making two very material interventions in the process of Brexit. But before the referendum, were you very much involved? What brought you into it?
So I was campaigning. I've been a very vocal campaigner post the global financial crisis. So I contributed and managed to write text in 3 EU directives. So I was travelling around to the member states, lobbying them to get this legislation through, to bring free transparency, stakeholder changes, bonuses in the city, things that were very unpopular with the city and the status quo. But because of that, I was known to quite a few people in Europe through that lobbying, which led to, so I'd started in 2009, and by 2014, I'd achieved these changes and reforms. So I'd had a 5-year period of doing that. And then lots of people in the city knew me. I'd also been working, campaigning and funding and helping some of the work that led to the Modern Day Slavery Act, ironically, that Mrs. May's government passed. And I was very proud of that work and the fact that she got that through Parliament. So I was known in the sort of lobbying world. I was known in the political world for doing that sort of advocacy. And I was approached in October 2015 by a group of people who knew me, both in the UK and Europe, and said, look, Gina, we need a woman on the Remain side to go out and do these debates, because at the moment they're all men. They're all, white stale men who are going out. And we need somebody who has background in the city, but understands the law, understands policy, understands detail. Would you do it? And I said, I would, as long as I didn't stay in London, because it had already struck me that a lot of the campaigning from the Remain side was very London-centric. So I said I would volunteer, which I did. And so I was on panels and debates and town hall events in Minehead to Taunton to North Wales, Cardiff, Liverpool. I travelled around the country not a lot. And this is where I'd say some of the Remain voices were very arrogant to think that they didn't have to go out of London and they didn't have to speak to places where people were disaffected. And I came back in the February of the following year before the referendum, and I sort of tried very aggressively to reach out to some of the top people in the Remain campaign saying, you've got to change your messaging. Every street I'm walking down has Leave voters. People are using on the doorstep terms like take back control. I could see the marketing, I could see the communications were being incredibly effective from the Leave side. I saw it in real terms on the ground with real people. And I was told I worried too much. Honestly, Peter, that was the response I got back. Don't worry. British people won't take chances. They won't do it. You know, Britain talks about it, but it's not the British way to make waves. And so they won't do it. You worry too much. I was told that so many times.
And it must have seemed at the time, it certainly seemed to me, that a lot of the voices, quite literally in some cases, the voices of senior Remainers who were very much platformed, were establishment, that posh, blandly posh or poshly bland or many of those things, whereas the voices that they chose to platform for Leave were more varied and interesting.
Yes, and oddly, from very similar backgrounds. They actually were from very similar backgrounds on both sides. But the way they presented themselves was quite different. I tried to say that we should have, on the Remain side, we should have someone from the NHS, because that was such a big, it's the golden chalice, isn't it? It's our NHS. So I was sort of saying we should have people from the NHS, we should have people from teaching, because academia would be affected. We should have people from the farmers. I was already talking about what was going to happen to farming in the UK.
Yep.
So, you know, I'd reached out to the NFU, I'd reached out to all these organisations. So I was trying to help the campaign by doing all these things. And because every day we would get this hymn sheet of what we should say on different topics. And I would always turn them down and say, I'm sorry, but you can't go with that fact or figure. Or, you know, that's just not going to help our case. What we need to do is get real voices. And again, they were like, oh, we don't need those sorts of people. But that's exactly who we needed. That's exactly who we needed. We needed the leading Italian, you know, oncologist who was here, who was saying he was going to go back because of the way he was experiencing, he and his young family were experiencing the hate that was coming out of the campaign, and that he loved Britain and why he was here. And, you know, those are the sorts of people we needed.
Yep.
But again, I go back to the arrogance of the people who ran the Remain campaign. It was all theoretical and was not going to happen. And that's the odd thing, Peter. On both sides, I was hearing the same thing. I was hearing the main Leave voices and the main Remain voices both saying that it was not going to happen. So don't worry.
Isn't that extraordinary? Isn't that extraordinary? So it was a leap of faith or a leap of greed or whatever it was. In all those cases, it wasn't an absolutely confident strategy.
It wasn't a confident strategy. And if you think back of how, you know, the Eurosceptics that were in Thatcher's government even, you know, there are some of these individuals, like John Redwood, for example, who'd be, you know, they'd always been Eurosceptics. They hadn't changed their minds. It wasn't a new grievance. And Cameron used the country to try to heal the Conservative Party. And he completely misjudged the British people. And I would say, because remember, of course, it was Clegg as well. And I've said to Clegg, to his face, before he left for the US, I said that, you know, you are partly to blame for this because you were in government and you could have said no to the referendum. And his answer back was, no, we were the minority party. And I said, well, it still doesn't matter. What you could have at least done is say that the Referendum Act had to have really robust procedures in it and to make sure that it was a properly held referendum. And you didn't do any of that. So, you know, there are lots of individuals who, in hindsight, what they did is then ran away from the mess they caused, but they were negligent on behalf of our country.
Yep. It's very interesting when we finally get Nick Clegg on a big platform with a lot of questions about his subsequent career for Meta and all that. It sounds as if, this is an aside, but it's an interesting one, he was sort of stood down because the political weather had changed and the Meta didn't require a sort of nice liberal wash, as it were, and support of a lot of nice liberal initiatives. It needed, as its public affairs person, somebody much more Trump compliant. And I think it must have been very interesting for him to go through that process.
No, I believe the reason he got the role at Meta was actually because of the EU, because Meta were very concerned about the directives coming out in the EU. And, of course, Clegg had experience there, and his connections with the EU, it was less Trump and more the EU that I think Meta were worried about, because the EU has been much more robust in its regulations since it's bringing out, and its online directives have been much more robust, and they will carry on being so. And the fact that it's not just the rules that directly affect their content and the way it's regulated, their content and their abuses are regulated. It's also the environmental impact, because that's going to be the next fight, is to get companies, big tech companies and data centers, to reveal the data of how much energy and water they're using and the environmental impact of what they're doing. So that will be the next battle, and it's coming, because they've been trying to hide that under the pretense that it's competitive advantage that it gives them. So it's competitively sensitive data. So there were lots of things that the tech community were worried about, and Meta's been worried about, and that's why I believe he got the role.
But why has he lost the role now?
I think now it's because they've gone too far. And when they started sacking all the people looking at really disgusting content, the content checkers, I think, was one step too far for him once that had gone. I mean, it is disgraceful.
Mm. Well, that's one block of power that's now quite apparent. It was quite apparent at the inauguration just how powerful, and yet at the same time just how complicit those people were. They were recognised as being enormously powerful by being in a pen together, those great tech bros from Silicon Valley, but at the same time they were all required in one way or another to bend the knee to Trump. So maybe it's like Louis XIV getting all the toffs into Versailles, so he knew where they were, or Putin coming to an agreement with the oligarchs. Don't mess with me, and I won't put you into Siberia, and you can make as much money as you like. That sort of agreement. Very, very fascinating one. Now, coming back to your great intervention, how do you feel about Boris Johnson now?
What I'm going to say may sound very odd, but in the state of our British politics, where more and more of the data, forget about what people are saying, is showing that there is a possibility that Reform will do incredibly well at the next election.
Yes.
I actually think the Conservative Party needs to bring back Boris. And I'm saying this as somebody who is not a fan of him. I think he's disingenuous. I think he's not a fool. He's a very clever man, but is misused and is driven by narcissism. But I'm saying this because I think you need a personality. There is no denying, we've gone to personality politics. And you need somebody who can take on Mr. Farage. And I believe Boris can. And I don't believe, ideologically, I think he is a centrist. I mean, he was a Remainer in all intents and purposes. He is somebody, forget about what he writes there. You look at Stanley and the way he's been brought up. He does care about the environment. He does care. He's much more of a moderate than most people would say. He will be swayed by whatever he needs to say to get into power. We've seen that time and time again. He'll become one of the snake oil salesmen if he needs to. And so he's an opportunist. But that said, if he can bring together or bring back into the Conservative Party individuals who mean we have a real opposition party, then I think that's got to be a good thing for the country, because at the moment, Conservatives are not going to survive, in my view. I just don't think they will under the President's leadership. And we're seeing day in, day out rumours of more and more people jumping off that ship. It's a very much a sinking ship. And I think our country would be lesser for it. And I say that as not being a Conservative supporter in any way.
Yeah. So we need a strong opposition, a strong and legitimate, knowable opposition, if we're going to save democracy. Now, the other part of the case is what it is that reform actually is. There's one reform policy that everyone recognises, whether they're, no matter how they say it. You know, people will cite a number of attributes of reform when it's only immigration that they really understand or are thinking about. But what are reform's other policies?
I'm not sure what reform policies are, but the reform because they don't have to justify anything. They can say, and they are very good at feeling the tempo of the nation and getting, taking the pulse of what it is that is driving people emotionally. And when they do that, they come up with things like the Britannia card, for example. But reform in its plainest terms is a group of businessmen who have no political understanding of the structures, the institutions, or the consequences of destroying trust in those institutions. They're a group of businessmen who seek for themselves power and money. And that's what it's about. Reform is a narcissistic group of businessmen. That's it. I mean, you look at Trump in America, you look at, what if Raj was to come to power here? Yes, he would launch. He's already involved in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. That will do him very well. He's been dealing gold when he lost his seat and he wasn't coming back. Richard Tice is a property man. His father was one of the most successful property people in the UK. He's a businessman. He's into property. The chairman there, who, is very, very strange how he supposedly made money from this huge luxury company that nobody can really quite trace, but the former chairman. But these are business people, the Candy brothers. These are all people who will turn the UK into their own revenue streams.
Why is it that nobody's noticed what seems the most screamingly obvious thing about the Reform Party, that the key people in it are almost exclusively rich or rich adjacent, and the sort of richness that, for instance, Nick Candy represents would be very surprising, I suspect, to your average red wall voter, because it's not only extreme wealth that is Nick Candy's customer base, it's global extreme wealth. It is what people used to call rootless cosmopolitanism of very, very super rich people. And his customer base, I don't know how many British people there are in number 1 Knightsbridge, but I would have thought very few.
Well, I believe his flat in number 1, the Candy Brothers, or Nick Candy's flat, is up for sale for £175 million, which is, totally, not just eye-watering, just impossible to understand how a flat can cost that much money. But this is where they're so clever, because when people have bought in emotionally, it's almost like a cult. Once you've bought into it, you don't see the nuance. You don't see what's behind them. You feel the messages, you feel the emotion, and that's where they're so clever. The emotional engagement they're getting with the public is not to be underestimated. And they don't actually need a lot of external money to do it, because they're all very wealthy in their own right. But they do have connections to very wealthy individuals. And, there are questions about how they're being funded, etc. I know they say it's membership, but, there are questions around it. But these are very, again, go back to history. They're individuals who are incredibly powerful, incredibly wealthy, incredibly clever, and know how to position themselves in the eyes of the ordinary man and woman in the street as being their brother or sister, being one of them. And it's incredibly clever. I mean, I was talking to a so-called social psychologist the other day, and they were saying there's a thing in the animal kingdom where some of the birds will do is they'll come and pretend to be, they'll jump into your nest and they'll be the ones who look and sound, and they'll mimic the bird that's there to catch the prey. And I just think, in a way, that's what they're doing. They're mimicking the people who need to vote for them, the disillusioned, the disadvantaged, the mistrust, the people who have no trust in politicians of any party, saying they're all the same. They're managing to mimic them in a way that's incredibly clever.
Well, you were right to go out of London when you were campaigning. I'm fascinated by the difference in knowledge and recognition between people in those tiny London bubbles, very important but very tiny, and outside them. Recently, the BBC did a focus group talking to people who voted Labour recently, asking them how they were feeling now. And there was a funny little exchange at the end when somebody was saying, in effect, that Farage was a man of the people. And I think the implication was that Starmer was not. And you thought, How can you not know that? How can it not be screaming at you from your every screen, from your every loudspeaker, that it's exactly the other way round? But you have to remember that those perceptions are different outside the London bubble. So the idea that Farage is a man of the people, and somebody stepped in and said Farage had been to a public school and was the son of a stockbroker, whereas Starmer was not, absolutely was not. And they looked surprised at this new information. How is it, and whose fault is it, that people don't understand those very basic things about those candidates?
It is fascinating, and I think it didn't happen overnight, unfortunately. We're sowing the seeds of a lot of mistrust and a lot of mismanagement in politics for over, a good 20 years or so. But I'll give you another example just to confirm what you're saying. I remember, you've just reminded me of, I did a meeting in Minehead in a big hall with lots of older, mainly male white men who were all screaming and shouting at me and wouldn't when I came on stage. And I sort of just sat there and waited till they stopped screaming. And I said, well, I'm here to talk to you if you let me talk. And, I thought they were not going to spend an hour shouting. So they did quieten down. And one of the first things I said to the crowd, why are you voting leave? Because most of them were going to. And they said, immigration. So we can send them all back. And I said, leaving the EU means it's only EU citizens that are going to stop coming. And to fill the workforce, you're going to get an awful lot more people who look like me. That's actually what I said to them. And they were insistent. No, it's to stop all foreigners. Leaving the EU, in their minds, was going to stop everyone coming. How can you convince people that was not true? But that is something they believed with all their heart. And I could not dissuade them on that evening that was not going to happen.
Leaving the EU means the end of immigration.
Yes,
in their minds.
That was the take. That was exactly what they heard and understood. They would not be dissuaded by it. Doesn't matter what the arguments brought up, the facts, the figures, the data. It doesn't matter. None of that mattered. Yep. You could not get through that mindset. And I think this is where we are at the moment. It's now embedded. And Farage has done this since he got into politics in Europe. He was the one who's standing up. He is embedded in the mind of the populace as being the man of the people, even though there is nothing about him that is. Look, this is a man who, was queuing up outside the German embassy to get a German passport in case Remain one, so he could leave. People don't know those sorts of things about him. But I'm not sure we have enough time before the next election to undo the perceptions that have been sown over 20 years. I don't think we have time to do that, which is why I say, and I suggest, that what we need to do is be realists about where the public sentiment and perceptions are. And if they perceive Boris Johnson as being the other man of the people, who they believe and love and will forgive anything, then maybe he's the one who needs to come back to take on Farage.
It is completely fascinating that trail has been set for a very long time, as you say, and those perceptions will be very difficult, if not impossible, to change. Because I'm obsessed with the unseen hands behind culture wars, I'm naturally very interested in the way that reform is connected with their American counterparts. And there was the suggestion of very large American money made recently. That's been rather tamped down, but people were talking. So Elon was talking about giving reform an enormous amount of money by British political standards.
It's not just the money, because actually the money is one issue. You need to have money to do, and their membership model, they will get money. It's actually the strategies and the thinking and the use of the internet and, using the tech bros in Cambridge Analytica type style to reach individuals. Because one of the things I've been told is that they're being incredibly clever. And again, it's happened in history before, but now they're using it via the internet as well as in person, is the active seeking out of disadvantaged or disaffected young men who will be of voting age in the next election. So presently, they are not of voting age. So we're talking of 14 to 16-year-olds who are not presently able to vote, but whom are being attracted to. They have very few role models, or they don't have a stable family environment. So in a way, they're being exploited by Daddy Farage. And he is the father figure. He is the one that they can talk about and go out. And they're already going out recruiting others, speaking on platforms, introducing him at events. I mean, this is the sort of thing I'm told is already, and that's incredibly, incredibly worrying, because it is literally what we saw in the past, the 1930s, is how you use youth to actually, because they are much more black and white. They don't see things in the same sort of, if you like, adult, nuanced way that you do when you've experienced life. So they're they're easier to mold and much easier and much more powerful advocates of the message you're trying to get across. And now, if that is true and being pursued as a mainline strategy for a lot of we do have in communities around Great Britain, many disaffected working class white young men who then are also being influenced by influencers who are misogynistic, anti-women. All of this is connected.
The Tates, Jordan Peterson, those sorts of people.
Yes. I mean, you remember Farage came out and said he supported Tate.
I didn't. That's a new one on me, but unsurprising yet shocking, if you see what I mean, given the Tate's histories. Now, a change in your life. We haven't seen quite so much of you recently for very understandable reasons. You've been ill, but now you put your hat in the ring for Cambridge Chancellor. Tell me about that.
Yes, I was diagnosed with a rare cancer last year. I finished my treatment in February, then had operations and things in March, and I'm not completely over, but I'm well on my way to being well. But I was approached by a group of academics at Cambridge in February who told me that the chancellorship was coming up, and I was sort of rather bemused and honoured, but bemused, and sort of said, well, I'm not an alumnus. They said, no, you don't have to be. You can stand. And I sort of said, well, it's a ceremonial role with lots of gowns and dinners, and I'm not interested. And they said, no, there actually is more that you can do. And we feel it's time things change. And this is coming from inside, across different departments of academia. And so I set about, in my usual way, Peter, of looking at the Constitution, reading the statutes that confer powers onto the Chancellor. And I discovered actually the Chancellor does have statutory powers to make sure the university's officers are performing their duties in a proper fashion, sitting on the council. So there are things. And I think at this time, let's think of the bigger picture we've just been talking about. If there is distrust in politics, if we have professional politicians and don't have the intellectual and expert knowledge to take us into a future that's much more sustainable, then I think we have to look at experts in academia. And I know it's part of the political playbook to say we don't need experts. Think of Gove. We don't need experts. We don't need academics. We don't need great thinkers. I think it is exactly what we do need at this time. But what we need them to do is to innovate and perform their excellence and their innovation, their creativity, connecting it back to society, not in isolation from society. So I see the role as very much one in which Cambridge is an opportunity for Cambridge to fulfill its mission, but in a way that actually helps progress society and helps mend some of what's going on. Because if we don't mend people's lives, we talk about broken Britain, but to the world, if we do not look at how we tackle the negative effects of AI, climate change, the impacts of that will have on employment, on work, on living, mental health. If we do not tackle these issues, then the political system in a way will remain broken. So I see this as a different prismatic approach, which is I'm coming at it in a different way, which is through the lens of education, knowledge, and using that in a way that helps social foundations. So that's why I decided just to go forward and accept the invitation to stand.
There's quite a lot of business hinterland to Cambridge because of the Silicon Fen effect and all the enormous amount of investment that there is in the Cambridge area in those sorts of businesses, which is not very often talked about.
Oh, it's extraordinary. And that has to be commended and increased, because only this week Cambridge has signed a partnership with the universities in France to develop more ethical AI. And this is the thing. It's not just about advancement and being a new Silicon Valley. It's about ethical leadership in AI. And this is what we need to develop. It's AI that is not just going to be destructive, but it's going to be responsible. And that's where Cambridge could lead in this. And I think there is a place for them to do so. And also at the time where, because of the Trump administration, their attack on academia and their dislike for universities, and there was a survey in an American publication called Nature, and 75% of scientists have said they feel frightened about what is happening in the US and would consider leaving. That's an extraordinary figure. So, Cambridge has an opportunity to offer sanctuary to those great thinkers. And again, that's happened in the past. It did so with Einstein and Eric Froome and great thinkers of the past who have come and carried on their work and their research and their thinking to advance all of our societies and lives. And I think Cambridge has the opportunity to do that again, to be a sanctuary for those that are being disaffected in the US. And other countries are putting efforts into that, but we're not putting as much effort in the UK. So again, I think, yes, it's great the work they're doing, the research, medical research, the research they're doing into solar panels and renewable energy. These are all fantastic initiatives. But as a chancellor, I think part of the role is also being much more vocal and outward-facing about those achievements. And that in turn will help our economy and our standing as a country in the world. So it's not just about how do you work in Cambridge, but how do you advocate for the work that Cambridge is doing on an international stage, which therefore attracts funding and money and more of the soft power, an interest in the soft power in the UK.
The British establishment, whatever that means, have been very, very cautious about doing anything that might irritate President Trump. And I think the business of saying to disaffected American academics is something that they're cautious about. But I think about the extraordinary, to me, example of Jason Stanley at Yale and Timothy Snyder at Yale saying this society is overstepped the mark into real authoritarianism, and we are both going to Canada. They've both gone to Toronto, but they could have gone to Cambridge, couldn't they?
Well, this is what I find. So Canada's being actively doing so. I had a pushback from somebody who's not very supportive of my candidacy saying, oh, Gina, you're being, what about all the things that the government's doing and the others we're doing? And I said, look, so the government have put 54 million into a fund to attract US academics. Well, around the world, but US academics primarily. I said the EU have put €500 million into their fund. And Canada is actively looking. We will lose out on this golden opportunity to bring the greatest minds to work with us, the researchers, but also it's the foreign students, because remember that Trump is saying that universities have to end their visas for foreign students. So you've got students who may be midway through their courses or seeking to apply and looking elsewhere in the world. Which university would they go to that is as prestigious and has a reputation for excellence? Well, come to Cambridge, come to the UK. And so it's not just for Cambridge itself, but for the other universities in the UK. We have got to be much more proactive in attracting talent, not just from students, not just from the lecturers and the researchers and the great minds, but actually from the students as well.
So what's the two-liner for us to end on? Vote for Gina because...
If you want a forward-looking university which will fulfill its mission of using research, education and excellence in the pursuit of human progress.
Splendid. Thank you very, very much indeed. And I look forward to seeing how the competition goes. And on Monday, I'm going to see someone I was talking to in one of my favourite clubs. And I was telling her that I was going to be talking to you on my podcast. And she said, oh, yes, Moira House.
Oh.
I was at Moira House. So I'm very much looking forward to talking. And I'll double check and I'll tell you who it was later.
Oh, wonderful.
Happy days near Eastbourne.
Oh, absolutely happy days.
Thank you so very much, Gina.
Been a pleasure, Peter.
Many thanks to Gina Miller. Next week on Culture Wars House Party, I'll be talking to the advertising titan who built a global empire from the UK. Sir Martin Sorrell reveals the hidden power plays of tech, politics and business. He's the man who knows where the world is really heading. This podcast is presented by me, Peter York, and it's produced by Kate Dixon at Good Egg Productions. Do listen in again. Goodbye.